very good to welcome all of you who are gathered here and our many viewers online to the 2020, or 2025 rather, Corcoran Chair Conference sponsored by the Center for Christian Jewish Learning here at Boston College. I am Dr. Dan Joslyn-Siemiatkoski, the Kraft Family Professor of Jewish-Christian Relations and the Director of the Center. It has been a real pleasure to work with Dr. Peter Ochs as the Corcoran Visiting Professor in Christian Jewish Relations this year. Dr. Ochs' influence on this field of Christian Jewish relations over his distinguished career has been immeasurable. And speaking on behalf of myself and also the Center's Associate Directors, Dr. Ruth Langer and Dr. Cahill, it has been a real pleasure for you to have been our colleague during this time here. Thank you, Peter. And Peter has designed this conference on the topic of responding to crisis, reparative reasoning in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. It's of no surprise to you gathered here that we are in an era of crisis. Indeed, this might be best described as the age of polycrisis. We're beset by compounding crises, each of which seems intractable and frequently yields further previously unanticipated crises. Our conference presenters will consider how the Abrahamic traditions can respond to some of these crises, notably those concerning climate change, sexual abuse, and technologies and the dangers they pose. The work of this conference over the next 2 days invites us to sit together as Jews, Christians, and Muslims. At times we'll sit with anxiety, discomfort, perhaps even fear. But we'll also reason together, learn together, and develop new strategies of repair for a world that desperately needs it. I'm grateful to all of our presenters and respondents who have taken time to engage in this work. Likewise, I'm grateful to you who have gathered here with us in person and those who are attending online. And to Dr. Camille Markey, previously mentioned Associate Director of the Center for Administration, I am especially grateful for her careful preparation for this conference. I know Peter shares in that gratitude. And now I'm happy to turn things over to Dr. Peter Ochs for some further words.
Not on. Am I on? With this. Daniel, thank you so very much for the words, and deep thanks as well to Ruth Langer and Camille Markey, guiding all phases of planning and producing this conference. Warm thanks to the chair of the theology department, Andrea Vicini, the director of the comparative theology program, Catherine Cornell. Warm thanks as well to all of you participants, observers, who have worked so hard to get all the papers, so I can say have worked so hard to generate a remarkable. A deep thanks as well to John Corcoran for conceiving of and funding this remarkable center, Christian and Jewish Studies. I can be personal. I adore being here in the center and at Boston College, working with center faculty and all the in both the center and other parts of the college. More than that, I've been blessed to discover, continuously, I've been blessed to discover the treasure of Boston College itself, its capacity to nurture spirituality and community, the highest level of intellectual excellence. We've gathered at a time of overwhelming threat and crisis. We've also brought together some of the world's leading theologians and religious ethicists, social thinkers, bioethicists, poets, and scholars of the saints and sages of traditions. They will offer us significant responses to the question of what to do in the face of overwhelming threats. What can we do as everyday human beings who may be frozen in fear in face of what's overwhelming? Our speakers and discussants ask what they can do when their worldly and religious training itself seems inadequate in the face of overwhelming threat. You're about to hear them report on the results of their clinical examinations of these threats, and for the most part, they will say yes. According to any instrument of observation I have, they will say, I can confirm that the threat is real, and that our present society's best institutions of research and service are overwhelmed. How do Abrahamic communities tend to respond to times? Conference sessions will examine such issues as climate change, sexual abuse, and dangerous technologies. Participants will raise such questions as what religious groups lead efforts to address such crises, what assumptions and beliefs guide them, what skills do they bring to this work, what processes of investigation, reasoning, reflection, and testing to assess this work. The time is urgent, let's get to work.
Thank you very much, Peter, for further orienting us to the themes and the work of the session. And now I'm pleased to be chairing our first session today, featuring Laurie Zoloth to my immediate left of the University of Chicago, and Lisa Cahill of Boston College next to her, and we've already heard from Peter Ochs. For everyone's information, full bios of all our speakers in the program book, and available for those viewers online. There's a link for them as well. Peter had asked us to dispense with the academic formalities of introductions and biographies to get to the real conversation. So as part of the design of this conference as well, Peter discerned a form in which each panel will be introduced by the chair with previewing what the presenters will offer. And the purpose of this is to situate their arguments in advance in order to promote fuller participations by the rest of us gathered here. So in other words, Peter wants you to speak. So be prepared to speak at the appropriate time. So to orient us then, Laurie Zoloth will speak on the crisis of Techne and the end of the world. A dramatic title. She will ask how the morality of Techne, that is technology, ought to be assessed and responded to. This argument is filtered through an awareness that a hallmark of the development of Western culture has been the advancement of forms of technology. Technological changes from the Roman Empire to the Industrial Revolution, among the examples she offers, have both helped define the nature of that age, but have also been world-altering events for people who became subject to the conditions of those ages. And so the same is true of the biotechnological revolution in which we find ourselves now. We will learn about the startling potential of a new form of biological manipulation termed mirror life that Laurie will spend some time unpacking for us. And her key question for us is what we ought to do about technology that can destroy the world. How are we equipped to address rapid advances in life-altering technology? And what might be learned from religious reasoning in addressing these profound challenges? Where Zoloth's paper asks us to face the problems of Techne, Lisa Cahill will speak to us on the realities of the polis, especially how to approach rival claims when dealing with crisis. Her paper, Crises, Contexts, and Convictions, Getting from Impasse to Hope, examines how the Catholic Church has become deeply polarized in attempts to respond to the current climate crisis. The stunted capacity of the Church to deal with the climate crisis reflects the larger crisis of the polis in our age. The polarization of complex societies renders them unable to respond well to crisis, which is illustrated in impasses over moral reasoning. And Cahill will offer us 3 ways of thinking about how to move past such impasses. First will be a framing of the contextual and practical nature of reason. Second, an investigation to what's needed to develop a politically effective response, which is framed in terms of effective knowledge. And finally, Cahill will draw our attention to the problems of political will and what a pragmatic response to this problem might entail. After this, we'll hear a response from Peter Ochs, our Corcoran chair, on finite and non-finite problems, finite and non-finite reasonings. He will help us navigate the questions raised by Zoloth and Cahill concerning how to respond to the ethical challenges that the human construction of the world has provided in terms of Techne and the polis. So I turn things over to Laurie Zoloth.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you, Peter, for inviting me here. I hope. And wonderful hearing so far. I have to stay closer. More intimate relationship with Techne. How ironic. That's right. It's like between me and my actual philosophy. Like, perfect. Okay, so 1, Josephus sees the future of power. Imagine the Jew Josephus arriving in Rome from Jerusalem. He walks into a civilization that stuns him. Not only the crowds, the staggering beauty, the marble monuments, the enormous public gardens, it's the weapons, and the army. What he sees is new Techne on an enormous scale, not only in quantity, with legion after legion of battle-trained men and a huge bureaucracy that's organized an empire, but in quality. The Romans have cannons and catapults and engineered multi-story scaffolding, 3 kinds of spears, shields, lightweight metal armor. He was seeing a combination of technological genius and disciplined power, and he knew that the world he left behind in Jerusalem would need to rethink the war against this empire or be utterly destroyed. His failure to convince his compatriots to understand what this new technology could achieve marked the end, a certain way of thinking, especially for the order of a theocentric polis and the relationship between humans and the divine presence. This insight that changes in technology are linked to power and thus can be used as weapons of domination has been repeated over and over in the last 2,000 years. At each moment of change, philosophers and theologians have had our own task, which is to radically reimagine what philosophy should think about the end of the world. This change in thought occurred dramatically in the Industrial Revolution, again with the advent of nuclear physics. Now here we are, faced with the collusion of world-ending technologies and the epistemic crisis within the liberal narrative frames that we had relied on as stable. 2, World's End. Poem, To Posterity, Bernard Brecht. Indeed, I live in the dark ages. He who laughs has not yet heard the terrible tidings. Here we are, if we see honestly, the precipice on which we stand at the end of the known world. These challenges, the politics of extremism on the left and on the right, violence at every single level, from the sidewalk in front of one's home to the wider world. We confront the existential and inevitable question of a rapidly changing climate and the brute fact that the world that such a climate will create will become inexorably uninhabitable across large areas of the globe. This will bring an end to the world as we have known it for the last 3 millennia, the time in which all of Jewish thought was imagined and debated and codified. And what does this mean to seriously confront this? Of course, it's not the first time we've lived in the face of the end of the world, and for Jews, surely not. The world that was European Jewish life, both the elegance of the salons, the art, the music, the intensity of the shtetl, the high courts of the Hasidic masters, the dairy farm of my own family, my grandfather's beloved library, my uncle's revolutionary visions, are now only memory. Emmanuel Levinas argued then that dark times need human freedom, a life lived beyond the material logics and the ideologies of the state. In his end times, after the spasms of violence had passed and the world was smoldering, there was still stubbornly this wounded world, one we inherited, and philosophers returned to speak of the unspeakable. What if liberal ideology is not enough, says Levinas. We must ask ourselves, he says, if liberalism is all we need to achieve an authentic dignity for the human subject, the equal dignity of each and every soul, which is independent of the material or social conditions of the people, is due to the power given to the soul to free itself from what has been. In short, we need a different way of thinking. Margaret Sussman, publishing in 1946, argues for this new thought as well. At the bottom of this change of mind, she says, is a new reliance on one's own understanding of reason, the result of the dialogical encounter with the unfathomable, from which hope arises as a messianic promise. It can arise precisely because messianic hope is not bound to the past. It is dependent instead on the way we work through it, to live out of the unfathomable. World's end. And then we live out the unfathomable. And yet, let us not ignore the reality that our precarity really may be unprecedented, for it is not only this world, it may be the idea of a world that includes what we know as civilization itself at risk. Climate change is only the most urgent of our current crises. It's the outworking of the Industrial Revolution, when steam engines ended that world a feudal economy, changed forever the labor of a rural peasantry, the power of the church, and the political horizon. As in the first century, philosophy and theology were also shaken and then reborn by the technology of industry, and they rethought thought. New possibilities of the human being emerged, new powers too, and of course, the lustful partner of power, domination and war. A new world created and an old world utterly destroyed. The steam engine was the 18th century Techne, whose long, slow toll is climate change. And nuclear fission was the 20th century Techne that still hangs above us, still in the menacing air. But this is not all. For in our time, we have the complex merger of molecular biology and artificial intelligence, and both carry their own significant challenges. 3, Black Mirror. Let me explain one example in some detail, the very new threat called mirror cells, a biological science project that may fundamentally change how you think about our future, its fragility, its capacity, and our shared fate. First, consider young Louis Pasteur in 1848, noticing something surprising about the crystals he was observing under his microscope. The crystals seemed alike, but sometimes rotated light to the right and sometimes to the left, a puzzle since in every other way the crystals were chemically identical. He reasoned that many molecules must be disymmetric, and from this observation thought all of the world was made thus and so. The universe, he says, is an asymmetrical entity. I'm inclined to believe that life as it is manifested to us must be a function of the asymmetry of the universe, or the consequences of this fact. Or if one placed the entire set of bodies that compose the solar system, each moving in its own way before a mirror, the image shown would not be superimposable on the reality. And this phenomena is what we have come to name chirality, or the handedness, a mirrored property of all basic reality. Chiral molecules cannot be superimposed on their mirror image, and this is just as deeply structured into the molecules of the world as time or electrical charge. Your left hand cannot be superimposed on your right hand, and thus, all the way up and down the chain of being, this deep structure is repeated at nearly every scale. Molecules, seashells, binding plants, from the subatomic to the microscopic. We know now that biological life has had this basic shape, and it is true for every living thing, the deep, turning gyre of creation. The world is made thus and so. But it could be otherwise. It's long been speculated that it would be possible to make a mirror of the world, or at least an organism in which for every disymmetrical capacity, in every way that the thing had handedness, its constituent molecules could be structured in the opposite direction, reversing its symmetrical structure to the opposite hand of existence. Perfect reflection. It was not possible to do more than think this was an intriguing idea, that one could make a mirror, reversing the structure of existence, but this has changed. A steady stream of scientific advances have created the possibility that you could make mirror life scientifically feasible. And a recent report explains how the tools of modern synthetic biology could allow for particularly terrifying use of this handedness of the world by making a mirror bacteria. Alarmingly, this is a technology that has no near real-term benefit and tremendous, mortally serious risks. This article was written by some of the most internationally recognized, qualified scientists in the field, and it presented a clear and unambiguous warning, a warning to humanity never to do this. Unlike naturally occurring bacteria, mirror bacteria may not have any robust biological adversaries, and perhaps not the immune systems of any living organism on the planet. That perhaps is critical. For any cell with the capacity to simply replicate itself over and over and over without any foes could quickly and steadily coat any membrane, surface, or cavity, internal or external, leaf or trachea. Once made, if there was even one mistaken release, a mirror bacteria could infect large swaths of the global ecosystem. Even if effective measures, a mirror antibiotic, for instance, were created, we would not be able to inoculate the globe at the scale required to protect, well, every living thing. If emergency drastic measures were taken, bleach everything, quarantines, mirror bacteria could still live and thrive in hidden soil, hidden water, forests, spreading to all farm food crops, to every last tree on every last front yard, to every lovely furry creature, to every puddle on the playground, to every hand you grasp, multiplying and unwinding the living world. Now, risky ideas are often presented to bioethicists by eager scientists. Normally, we're reassured about their danger because research this risky science is really too hard to do mostly, despite their scientific optimism. And we know that genetically engineered organisms often fail in the wild. Genetically modified insects are too weak to survive in the real world, they lose competition for resources. But in this case, remember that while the first iterations of the mirror life may fail, given the speed and ingenuity of the field and the AI which can accelerate directed evolution, each version will be better and stronger and more fit. A mirror bacteria may not need to compete at all, but simply do an end run around biological systems using mechanisms we know nothing about. And scientists worry then that mirror life will not just survive, but could thrive, rapidly mutating and adapting to a vast array of niches. Bioethics is no stranger to judging bold, world-shifting science projects like this. We ask, what is the right act and what makes it so? Might there be some projects that are impermissible to do? Might there be some knowledge that it's impermissible to seek? In 1999, a group of scholars in the law, theology, and philosophy, convened by the American Association for the Advancement of Science, met with scientists who were considering creating permanent changes in the human genome. And we came up with a framework about new science ideas and suggested a moratorium on human genome editing, which was still in place, except for one doctor, over the next 25 years. Bioethicists have returned to these questions, and some projects fail on one or two of our ethical criteria, and then some go forward under caution. But it is stunningly rare to find a project like Mirror Life that fails so profoundly on every single ethical criteria. Mirror organisms are not merely a tinkering with existing organisms, swapping out DNA between species. They pose extreme, irreversible, and globally collective experienced risk. Immune systems in human, animals, and plants have evolved for billions of years to confront bacteria, all systems that expect natural chirality. Moreover, all of our modern systems of infection control are structured around eliminating and controlling right-handed bacterial worlds. It is unknown how any of them would be successful in managing this threat without obliterating the world that they're intended to protect. This work is impermissible because of the context in which the work would be done, a world in which very real political threats and social divisions exist, a world in which distributing a clean glass of water has proven impossible to the world's poor. We're already in an uneasy truce with the existing bacterial diseases, and they're developing resistance to most of our given antibiotics. We face fierce opposition to vaccination. The world is already shaken by the calamity of a global pandemic, and H5N1 lurks just on the outskirts of our farms and wild marshes. It's a world in which lab accidents, by the way, are quite common, and containment has failed. There's currently no way to do even the basic proof of principle research safely. There's no international oversight, no way to police every lab, no way to realistically block a cascade of tinkering and enhancing the innocuous first steps of this work. And by the way, remember, there's no feasible benefit to the development of the work. In short, no. At a deeper level, however, there's profound philosophical issues at stake. Mirror world organisms are not merely a tinkering with an existing organism, swapping out this DNA. They're a basic undoing of the structure of biomolecular life itself, a deep ontological undoing that is structural, far more than the usual techne of modernity. This is the sort of research like atomic fissure or the first space flight that shifts our location in the world, undoing the essential thus and so that Pasteur suddenly realized undoes the structure of the real. Such research carries with it a troubling theological concept, which is that making a mirror world is making a not world to this one, our good world that is divinely created, Tov, a deep ontological undoing that is far more than the usual techne, far more than modernity. One of the most important aspects of the report is that you're hearing about it at all. The very scientists who are the most capable of doing it, who've previously worked most enthusiastically towards mirror life, are the ones calling for it to be stopped entirely. And they're asking for your participation in the debate about what to do next. And they've called for a broad international discourse about this issue. Of course, we do face an ironic paradox today. We've always called for public review of science. For instance, here's Hannah Arendt some 60 years ago writing that, quote, "There's no reason to doubt our present ability to destroy all organic life on Earth. The question is only whether we wish to use our new scientific and technical knowledge in this direction. And this question cannot be decided by scientific means. It's a political question of the first order, and therefore can hardly be left to the decision of professional scientists or professional politicians." But now that you've heard my example of the end of Techne at the end of the world, this discussion now includes you who are listening. Just now, when we're faced with a public, the very public we'd want to invite in, that despairs of us, that despairs of elites and mistrusts science, and a government that has just eviscerated the NIH and the CDC. Hannah Arendt, when confronted by the post-war world, newly nuclear, thinking about the human condition under a sky that suddenly contained spacecraft, asked, how does science change something so fundamental to our humanity? The Earth, she says, is the very quintessence of the human condition. An earthly nature, for all we know, may be unique in the universe in providing a habitat in which humans can move and breathe without artifice. But for some time now, a great many scientific endeavors have been directed toward making life also artificial, towards cutting the last tie through which even every man belongs among the children of nature. It is the same desire to escape from imprisonment to the earth that is manifest in the attempt to create life in the test tube. All science has limits. Some are intrinsic, the resistance to the natural world. There are certain research projects, though, that should never be done. It's rare to find a project so profoundly outside such limits. But of course, this is one. 4, the old books. Now, Brecht despairs of both theology and philosophy, writing, "The old books tell us what wisdom is. Avoid the strife of the world. I can do none of this," he says. "Indeed, I live in the dark ages." Brecht is overwhelmed. His world is ending, and actually it's going to get a lot worse for him because this poem was written after World War I, not World War II. He worries that the massacres, the injustice, the useless wars will consume all the time on earth that was given to me, he says. Yet he knows there will be survivors, and to them, posterity, the poem is written, "You who shall emerge from the flood in which we are sinking, think, when you speak of our weaknesses, also of the dark time that brought them forth." But we in Jewish philosophy just love those old books. In the Talmud, we also find a flood, not only the great flood of Noah, but the crossing of the Red Sea, understood here not as an open road like in the movie version, but as a terrible choice before a huge body of water. Here's the discussion in Sota about what is needed. Ometz Lev. Rabbi Yehuda said, this tribe said, "I'm not going in the sea first," and that tribe said, "I'm not going in the sea first," and then jumped in the prince of Judah, Nashon, and descended into the sea first, accompanied by his entire tribe. And in this regard, the tradition explicates Nashon's prayer, "Save me, God, for the waters are come in, even unto the soul. Let the water not flood, let not the water flood overwhelm me, neither let the deep swallow me up. Mark Margolis points out in his description of Omets Lev, which is courage of the heart, the Hasidic master, Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, is known for his famous teaching, Kol Holam Kulo Gesher Tsar Melod. The whole world is a very narrow bridge, and the main thing is not to fear at all. But Nachman's actual teaching, says Margolis, is far closer to our experience. Rather than use the Hebrew word to be afraid, he uses the reflexive form to cause oneself to be afraid. Courage is not about denying fear. Rather, the fundamental principle of courage is choosing not to frighten ourselves beyond the fear we already experience. Fear is unavoidable, perhaps even required. Courage is moving forward despite it. Floods, narrowing bridges, all the metaphors for our situation in which the very borders of this world would disappear. It is the language of climate change. It is the language of crisis. It is the language of war. Synthetic biology, genetic engineering, and AI, they're all here now. And they'll all operate like any other technological empire of power, initially for good, for order and repair. The Romans, after all, wanted to organize the world and channel the water and build public baths. The same synthetic biology researcher working on an interesting and important idea about how to address climate change. And of course, we need them to do that, even if the tools they develop are the same ones that they could use to make mirror cells. The danger within them calls us to careful thought, however, to a different way of thinking and to a clear-eyed assessment, the fundamental task of ethics, of judging what is good and what is evil, something that is theoretically should be straightforward, but in practice has proven nearly impossible. This world that we love, the wide sandy beaches of my childhood, the redwoods, their golden afternoon light shifting on ferns, the sweet smell of bay leaf, that world, colleagues, it's already ended. Global warming threats are so profound that the only reason we're not in constant despair is that the more instantly immediate threats rise to demand attention, like the mirror biology I just described. The crisis of the economy, the collapsing of democracy, the violence, pick any one. In my work, I've called for us to be interrupted enough to stop everything we're doing to focus entirely on seeking solutions to climate change. But it's exquisitely difficult when other urgent interruptions demand our attention, interrupting even that, or interrupting our interruption, not to mention the very real needs of our beloveds and laundry, and the brute fact that we're constantly told we are powerless in the face of the totalizing landscape of consumption. The old books of theology were written largely in a world of precarity. The threat of end times is felt vividly, and they remind us that this precarity is not new. Against this terror, faith is offered, something moderns found difficult too, hope. Hope emerges from a deep sense that God does not abandon God's chosen ones, even the least one, even the drowning one. Theology can offer hope, and perhaps Jewish theology most of all, bearing the faces as it does of the patient, hopeful across generations despite everything. Their faces are illuminated by a God that is spoken and can be spoken to, can be argued with. Brecht is wrong. Theology does not tell us to abandon the strife of the world. But what about now, in this world where so many seem to be drowning alone, the heavens silent? What can theology offer us as we think about the end of at least this world, if not all worlds? I do not believe that philosophy alone can offer hope. Philosophers are a grumpy lot, as we know. We cannot offer the political science, which surely would be useful in thinking about policy. And science can offer very clever solutions, and economists cannot tell you how much you'll pay for them, offering our life and death choices with little price tags. But Jewish thought offers something else, the determination to be for the other, prior to speaking, and of speaking posterior as well. The argument continues. This is the adult, agonistic task before us, to face the reality. And while it is darkness beyond darkness, climate collapse, and so many other shocks and trials, we only have the one capacity to face fear with nobility, to face even these end times with faith. Hannah Arendt, using that Brecht poem to speak of the need for philosophy, writes, even in the darkest of times, we have the right to expect some illumination. And that may well come less from theories than from the flickering and often weak light that some men and women in their lives and in their works will kindle under almost all circumstances and shed over the time span that was given to them on earth. Eyes so used to darkness as ours will hardly be able to tell whether their light was the light of a candle or that of a blazing sun. But that, can be safely left to posterity. Returning to the first century, Joseph did not succeed, and so could only write what happened next. And for that, at least, we're glad, for he describes the great lost beauty of a world as a man who loved that world. But he was not the only scholar who escaped from the burning world of Jerusalem. Yochanan ben Zakkai found another way out, not a doomed struggle and not capitulation, but a new way of thinking. Let me and my disciples go to Yavna, he argued, and there set up a university, well, actually, a tiny little house of study, and let us think. Thus a request both modest and monumental, let us think. And in and against the grain of all that was to follow in Rome, empire, war, Rabbinic Judaism thought quietly in the corner of this new world, and it was created there. A profoundly new way of thinking theologically about humans and our relationship to the divine presence, a new social order and a new way of reading and reasoning with the text, which allowed Jewish life to exist in exile, for love is stronger than death, and courage can overcome fear. It's why we still read about Rabbi Yehuda and believe him to be true. We do need to find a way to think together that is fundamentally different than what has been thought before, a task that cannot be done alone, a task that needs to be seen as urgent, for we really do, in life-threatening times. Like Brett, we need to think for posterity, and I'm hoping somehow that our words today and more can create theology for the end of this world and for the life in the world we live in now. My own youngest daughter had a daughter last year, a new baby Jew, grandchild 9, a sweet beauty, my posterity. So it is, of course, her face that I think about when we think about the end of the world, and hope that her eyes will see the illumination of our lives, the candles, fearlessly lived out despite our fear in this new world to come. It is a Jewish philosopher's prayer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laurie, for that stimulating offering. Lisa, I think we'll hand things over to you now.
Let me just see if maybe, let's see, is? So my paper is going to be less theological and maybe idealistic and less practical. Challenging the idea that that the religious community, any religious community, is one we, and what happens when religious communities face crises, and what are some ways to think about it. So it really is going to the practical side of ethics and so the questions that centered the conference, as Peter was for us at the beginning, were, first of all, how do the Abrahamic traditions respond to crises, and then who leads with what beliefs and skills. And I almost laughed myself when I thought at the practical level, what's the real answer to that? And the real answer is that religious traditions, like many other organizations, typically argue within themselves. They polarize, they divide, and sometimes they even split. And what happens is that there may be a common tradition of sacred texts or doctrines, rituals, practices, but different sides that are invested in different outcomes will argue that they have the authentic interpretation. And so it is hard for the community in a crisis to come together around a common solution. Instead, it seems to raise up what in the Christian tradition we call sin, which is jockeying for one's own advantage since a crisis is here, and competing for power and protecting one's own life. And if you're a Catholic, sadly, this is very easy to illustrate. So I'm going to take the climate crisis and my own tradition, Roman Catholicism, as a culprit. And I would like to begin by pointing to 3 recent Catholic interventions on climate change, just to give the illustrations, and then I'm going to raise 3 further issues for concern, and I will name these again as I go through. So the first intervention was Pope Francis's social encyclical called Laudato Si, on care for our common home. That was in 2015, and it was an ecology. And the Pope appealed for protection of the planetary environment, emphasizing to everyone, not just Catholics, that everything is connected, that we're all bound together, but also that climate change hits the core first. And so at the end of this encyclical, he composed a prayer which he offered in the hope that other people, especially those in the Abrahamic traditions, those who believe in a creator God, as he put it, would join him in religious commitment to our planetary environment. And turning to Catholics, he exhorted our community to prioritize climate change in our educational systems and in our liturgies, especially the Eucharist, as well as to mobilize more broadly against climate change with all like-minded partners. At the same time, despite these hopes, he predicted resistance from heads of state and elites, and thus he also turned to citizens and popular movements for action in line with a series of annual meetings of popular movements which he had initiated the previous year, which still continues. The second intervention was really a carry-through from Laudato Si', and it was an international synod of the Catholic bishops internationally, so they came internationally to Rome. And this synod was meant to encourage the implementation of Laudato Si', the encyclical which I just mentioned. Wonderful, thank you. This was called the Synod on the Amazon. So he focused on environmental issues in the Amazon basin, but of course realized that they weren't limited to that area. So the Synod on the Amazon brought together not only the episcopacies of different countries, but also worldwide Catholic cultures, represented by Catholic environmental organizations and indigenous peoples from the Amazon region. Yet, the convocation of this mix of Catholics in Rome did not run smoothly. According to the National Catholic Reporter, which is a progressive U.S. Catholic newspaper, quote, men and women in traditional indigenous dress marched to St. Peter's Basilica to open the synod alongside the cardinals and bishops. They lifted a small dugout canoe bedecked with fishing nets and surrounded Pope Francis, accompanying him to the front. A few days later, however, under the cover of night, some Italian dissenters to this cross-cultural effort, Catholics, threw 3 Amazonian figures, which they called Pachamama figures, that is a Mother Earth, Earth goddess image from Latin America. It was disputed what these figures should really be called, but they were images of pregnant women. There were 3 of them that were all the same, and they were clearly Amazonian characters. So the news source Reuters says that Catholic militants admitted that they stole statues they considered to be Amazon pagan idols from a church near the Vatican on Monday and dumped them from a bridge into the Tiber. Undeterred, Pope Francis apologized the next day, and at the opening mass, he had already warned the bishops taking part against being smothered, this is a quote from Pope Francis, smothered by the ashes of fear and concern in defense of the church's status quo. Indeed, the final document of this synod bemoaned the impact of extractive industries such as oil production, which fouls rivers and forests with spills, and mining, which is of course escalating in many regions with heightened demand for minerals required for clean energy transition. Wait a minute. Okay, so one was Laudato Si', the second was the Amazon Synod, and then the third was Pope Francis' statement after the Synod, Querida Amazonia, another document in which he urged the bishops and the whole church to learn from the wisdom of the Amazonian region, from the peoples, and from their indigenous traditions. So these 3 interventions were all of a piece, coming from a supposedly common Catholic authority, Pope Francis. But what was the actual follow-up to these 3 initiatives in this tradition under his leadership? So according to the supporters of the initiatives, the Amazon Synod broke new ground and it charted a path ahead for the Catholic Church. For example, a religious sister who ministers in communities along the Amazonian rivers, Sister Joanina Madeira, was quoted, "It was like saying, look, something new is beginning in the church. We have to keep going in that way, walking with the people." Similarly energized by Laudato Si, the Cardinal of Manila, Luis Antonio Tagle, began something called the Global Catholic Climate Movement, which circulated a petition in advance of the 2015 UN Climate Summit in Paris. The effort was largely driven by the church in the Global South, especially in the Philippines, and was signed by more than 900,000 Catholics. An environmental scientist, an American named Malcolm McCallum, writing in the journal Biological Conservation in 2019, gave a hopeful forecast to all of this, saying that there was a very rapid growth of public interest after Laudato Si, and seeing that as a reason for hope that environmental progress is just around the corner. And indeed, in 2015, so this would be right after the first of those interventions, Laudato Si, in December, the UN Paris Accord was signed by all of the participating nations, and that was indeed a sign of hope. Yet, as we all know by now, I'm sure, President Trump very shortly thereafter withdrew the US, and progress toward climate control globally since then has been dismal, including last year's COP29 in Azerbaijan, if you were following any of that. Glaringly, and especially an issue at the UN meeting last November, promises of the wealthy emissions-producing nations to develop alternative fuel sources and to help finance energy transitions in the less developed nations are year after year weakly implemented and continually fail to meet agreed upon targets. The Global Catholic Climate Movement that was started by Cardinal Tagle was later renamed the Laudato Si movement, and according to its website now, its mission is still to meet the Paris Accord target of limiting global temperature rise to 1.5 centigrade, a target that was in fact already exceeded last year. So meanwhile in the US, just to turn the lens closer to home, the unity of Catholics around this issue remains quite shaky. The Public Religion Research Institute found last November that a mere 1/4 of Catholics would only vote for a candidate who shares their views on climate change. Hispanic Catholics and non-Hispanic Catholics of color are slightly more likely than white Catholics to say they will only vote for a candidate who shares their views. And exit polls after the presidential election showed that, in fact, Donald Trump won the overall Catholic vote by a double-digit margin on Election Day after losing that demographic in 2020. Moreover, a large portion of Trump's improved performance among Catholics came from Latino voters, while a smaller part came from white voters. So there was an increase among Latino voters. More than religious affiliation, obviously, was at stake among these voters. Election results depended more on economics, immigration fears, and social class, all involving social structures and identities that intersect in political expressions of Catholicism. And this, I think, is a general reality. You know, people are not just Muslims, Jews, or Christians. They're white, they're people of color, they're wealthy, they're poor, they live in the US, they live in Honduras. So many different things figure into the way religious traditions end with these crises. So according again to Reuters in 2023, hundreds of Catholic institutions around the globe have announced plans to divest their finances of oil, gas, and coal to help fight climate change in view of Laudato Si. But in the United States, the world's top oil and gas producer, where about 1/4 of the population is Catholic, not a single diocese has announced that it has let go of its fossil fuel assets. That was in 2023. Big differences are striking between the so-called global north and global south. It is in the interest of the most affected regions to rein in rising global temperature. But the opposite is true of national and transnational entities that profit from the marketing and use of fossil fuels, and religious traditions are not immune from these dynamics. Where one is situated is a key indicator of climate change politics, even within religious traditions. Keeping these Catholic illustrations in mind, then, I propose 3 further considerations regarding religious traditions and crisis response. And all of these have to do, so our topic is reparative reasoning, or religious reparative reasoning. And so I have 3 points about that. And the first is the contextual and practical nature of all reasoning and knowledge. The second is the problem of what I will call effective knowledge, which is different from cognitive knowledge, because effective knowledge moves from the intellectual to the moral political level. And then the third concern is the moral direction or moral orientation of effective knowledge, a problem that we often capture in the term political will. What is the political will for? What are its goals? So first, the social and contextual nature of knowledge. Contrary to the individualist biases of moral theories based on so-called Enlightenment reason, irreducible agential freedom, and liberal political norms, many contemporary philosophers and theologians maintain that the situatedness of humans in complex and evolving contexts affects their processes of moral understanding and their agential capacities. The process of coming to knowledge is not always logical, coherent, and fully rational. Instead, moral understanding requires evaluative discernment of moral experiences and situations through complex, nonlinear assessments based on many factors, such as the agent's fund of interpreted experiences, comparable cases, the agent's pre-existing moral dispositions, and their perceptions of immediate impacts on known stakeholders, not least of all themselves. Today, alternative moral epistemologies include social epistemologies, feminist epistemologies, post-colonial and decolonial epistemologies, and standpoint theory. In general, all of these socially oriented epistemologies investigate the epistemic effects of social interactions, practices, norms, and systems. This does not necessarily result in absolute relativism of knowledge, however, as many social epistemologies are still committed to the pursuit of truth by individuals, groups, or collective agents. But these social epistemologies do surface that truth is pursued with the help of, or sometimes even in the face of, other people or relevant social practices and institutions. The point is that the agent's capacity for moral discernment, judgment, choice, and action is always context relative, albeit neither deterministically nor reductionistically. Agents do still have freedom within these contexts, but the context set conditions of possibility for what they can know and what actions are open to them at a different point in time. Members of religious traditions simultaneously inhabit multiple structures and cultures that are constantly and dynamically shaping our worldviews, our identities, and our agency, our power to act. It is these structures' dynamic intersection and change that makes possible novel moral political options and changing agential perspectives, knowledge, and choice. The more firmly personal and social life are channeled through relatively firm and comprehensive structures, the lower the adaptability of members' agential orientation. So change and agency depends on the ability to be exposed to different ways of thinking about things and options for doing things differently. In order to instigate change in favor of a social political goal, activists working through social movements and networks, for example, need to locate and exploit the places at which structures and identity circles intersect, even if narrowly so. These intersections provide chances to approach or attract non-aligned agents and win their support. And that's even true of religious change advocates working within their own tradition. Political conversion and effective knowledge arise when reasonable arguments are backed by new opportunities for cultural structural participation that are attractive, that are holistic, integral, and worldview affecting. Okay, I'm so worried I'm going to go over, but okay. Thank you. Ordinarily, this process must go beyond appeals to altruism, which is where the Catholic Church generally tends to stick. But that is important, but we need to go beyond it, because these are too easily overpowered by stakeholders' at-risk interests. As grassroots peace building and community organizing show, it is more effective to unite people with disparate or conflicting identities around shared social goals if those can be located, even if they're shared for very different reasons. That's a principle behind community organizing. In other words, other regarding motives, which are important and key to morality, are more politically effective if they're also shorn up by proportionate self-interest. So sin, as we would call it in theology, and injustice, as you might call it politically, could really be defined as disproportionate self-interest. But proportionate self-interest is neither sinful or unjust as long as it is working for the common good or with other stakeholders. But this whole dynamic between self-interest and action is why vulnerable people in climate-threatened areas are quicker to get on board with climate action in the Philippines, for instance, than people who may theoretically recognize climate threat and injustice, like delegates to COPs 29, but whose own welfare is not immediately at risk. That's really the crux of the challenge. And then that connects with my second concern. Understanding of a crisis that goes beyond intellectual grasp of the facts to understanding that is politically effective. Effective knowledge has both a cognitive and a conative dimension. And conative simply references knowledge that is connected with an intention or an effort to do something, in the words of the Cambridge English Dictionary. Effective knowledge leads to action with the purpose of realizing a good understood by the agent to be desirable. Effective knowledge draws on para-rational modes of understanding, not simply irrational, but supportive to the rational process. And these include emotions, affections, imagination, one's embodied experience in a material and social environment, and in play with tendencies including empathy and altruism, but also fear, xenophobia, competition, and aggression. Effective knowledge is related to traditional categories of virtues and vices as dispositions to act, a term from Thomas Aquinas. Not just randomly, random action, but in order to realize goods that are perceived. A virtuous disposition to act, is not just self-generating and self-validating. It's a relational orientation of an agent or a society or a social group to real goods in the world that exist independently of the virtue itself but to which the virtue inclines the agent. So a virtue is an inclination, a disposition to act for a human good that the agent recognizes, to which they are drawn, and which they are trying to achieve proportionately to the common good and to the goods of other people at stake. I'm going to say a bit more about only one dimension of effective knowledge, the role of the emotions. Ethical theorists over the past few decades have increasingly denounced the separation of reason and emotion, arguing that emotions are relational responses to states of affairs in the world and combine cognitive, evaluative, and conative dimensions. Zeroing in on Christian ethics and the emotions, a theologian and ethicist named Paul Lauritsen, almost 40 years ago now, defined an emotion as, quote, a culturally mediated experiential complex that consists of such diverse elements as physiological activity, expressive bodily responses, feelings, desires, beliefs, and evaluative judgment. Further, Lauritsen identified the cognitive components of this complex, beliefs and judgments, as the linchpin holding all these elements together. Much more recently, in 2021, Michael J. Cox, who has a book on anger as a political virtue, maintains that, quote, emotions provide a rich and highly relevant source of moral insight that should more robustly inform ethical analysis of and practical Christian responses to urgent social justice challenges. J. Cox confers with Lauritsen in proposing a cognitive view of emotion. Theologian Mark Wynne conceives of the emotions similarly in terms of formation within a particular tradition, as well as in terms of subject-independent values. So for Wynne, affectively constituted knowledge is a locus of personal identity, where knowledge is not merely notional, not detached from the real self and its concerns, but of its nature, motivationally effective and action guiding. This includes religious traditions, but no agent exists only in a religious tradition. Religious traditions themselves are not silos of identity. They are situated and evolving within constellations of temporal, geographic, national, and cultural landscapes. This is exactly what produces the difficulty of getting the members of any particular religious tradition, considered as a relatively unitary set of beliefs and practices, to respond in the same way to crises, especially one like climate change, whose benefits and costs are so unevenly distributed. And then this leads to the last of my 3 points, my 3 further points of concern after talking about the Pope's intervention. And the third one is lack of political will to accomplish the ends understood to be just, or more accurately, the failure to do so because of the force of disordered political will, which aims in a different direction. So that was Pope Francis on the selfish national interest, or the disordered political will. The moral political orientation of our effective knowledge differs. It can be more or less just or unjust. This is precisely the problem behind the failure of the UN annual COPS meetings, where much is agreed on and little is done, as Pope Francis well appreciated. I want to take just a very brief detour, a few sentences, to just indicate what I mean by justice, because it is a term so frequently invoked by social activists, but so rarely defined. And I will just say that as a base point, I'm working from the definition of justice in Catholic social teaching, and this is the definition that I think would be pretty widely shared. So just to telegraphically put this out there. Some of the elements of justice in this perspective are the common good, the dignity of every person, the entitlement of all to participate and benefit from the common good of society, mutual rights and duties, democratic institutions, rule of just law, the international common good, the self-determination of peoples and cultures, and in more recent teaching, the preferential option for the poor, better stated as the recognition of the existing agency and voice of the marginalized world majority. These values go back to the first social encyclical in 1891 and continue up to the present time. The real question for justice, so described, is not, in fact, whether there is wide recognition of essential human goods, such as food, shelter, freedom from violence, and so on, which, of course, everyone in every culture wants for themselves and their family. The real question for justice is equality or equity in access to and participation in these goods. And what we see in the foregoing climate example is disagreement about who deserves access to the basic goods reliant on a healthy planet, and with whom a community or religious community or subset thereof is committed to be in solidarity. In 2023, Pope Francis updated Laudato Si with a new document, Laudate Deum, where he laments, 8 years have passed since I published Laudato Si, yet our responses have not been adequate. The world in which we live is collapsing and may be nearing the breaking point. We will feel its effects in the areas of healthcare, employment, resources, housing, forced migration, and so on. And to express it bluntly, he continues, the African bishops stated that climate change makes manifest, quote, this is a quote from the African bishops, a tragic and striking example of structural sin. Regrettably, however, he concludes the climate crisis is not exactly a matter that interests the great economic powers, whose concern is with the greatest profit possible at minimal cost and in the shortest amount of time. I'm afraid that's going to overtake the moral efforts on nearer technology. In conclusion, I turn to a final source of wisdom on the religious reasoning dilemma of the climate crisis, a dilemma both of intellectual grasp and of just political will. And this is a Christian ethics colleague from the University of Virginia, whom Peter also knows, Willis Jenkins, who is a Protestant theologian. And in 2013, he published a book called The Future of Ethics, Sustainability, Social Justice, and Religious Creativity. And one of the premises of the book is that there can be ethical political problems that are so big that humans are actually incompetent to solve them. Like, we don't really know what to do about it. And he says that climate change is one of those problems. Not only can we not understand all the entangled causes or even the present dimensions, much less adequate solutions, we also can't marshal the moral resources that we take to imagine a different climate future, much less to take action on it. Jenkins insists, however, that the answer is not to get our theologies and cosmologies straight first, and from there deduce a religious climate answer. So he's kind of against, more theology is what we need. It's like we've got enough, but who's paying attention to it? So he then turns to American pragmatist philosophy to argue that religious communities should proceed pragmatically as he sees it. We should start in our specific locations by finding more achievable goals, he says, by taking responsibility for an overwhelming world. He says in any context, there are goals that are obvious and accessible. And here he's connecting with what I argued earlier about the interdependence of practices, social structures, identities, and moral capacity. And Jenkins thinks that if we pragmatically get involved and get active, if we have courage and overcome fear, as Laurie was calling us to do, then that might open possibilities for the responses we can conceive. I would say that it might expand not only communities' scientific knowledge of climate solutions, but even more importantly, our effective knowledge or our political will to make these solutions work. I think striving together might expand circles of climate solidarity and heighten political will. It might increase the virtues of wisdom, prudence, justice, and courage. Religious traditions confronted with climate change may get better at prioritizing long-term over near-term advantages and at solidarity with those who immediately face climate disaster as equal to our own niche preservation. More importantly, climate collaborators can stand to gain wisdom about how to sustain religious and moral communities that working together open ways of practical hope. That was a quote from Jenkins, and I will add with that.
Thank you very much, Lisa, for that. Now we'll hand things over to Peter for a response.
Am I on?
Very close to
Well, deepest thanks to these two great ethicists, Laurie Zoloth and Lisa Cahill, who have brought us immediately to the center of our conference, to open our eyes to overwhelming crises and with urgency to discern how our religious communities and more may address them. Their papers give me unexpected hope that we could together discern what resources would enable our societies to offer productive responses to such crises. Therefore, devote my response to the following three tasks. I draw out of Lisa and Laurie's words a set of instructions on how to address overwhelming crises. 2, I try to imagine the skills and virtues that I call responders would display if they followed this set of instructions. We call them last responders because they're our last hope. Finally, I try to imagine how responders would enter into teams of research and action in response to crisis. Instruction number 1 is to recognize that there are threats that exceed our capacities to meet them. Closer. Laurie's account of the Black Mirror is sufficient evidence of the need to recognize such threats, as is Lisa's account of failed responses to global warming. Laurie distinguishes such threats, he calls the monstrosities of this century, from the dark times, quote unquote, that our societies have faced, but in most cases addressed. He adds, of course, it is not the first time that we have lived in the face of the end of the world. Instruction number 2 is to recognize that these threats may be products of our own sciences, technologies, politics, and desires. Laurie learns from Josephus and from recent threats that major changes in technology are linked to power and can be used as weapons of domination. This phenomenon, she says, has been repeated over and over the last 2,000 years. Lisa narrates the resistance of the global north to controlling their industry's contributions to global warming. It reminds us that a significant part of any threat is how our society and political structure responds to it, so that without a political will, in her words, to enact repairs, threats increase rather than lessen. Instruction number 3 is to acknowledge that conventional responses will not suffice, but that we must search nonetheless for new, non-conventional ways of responding to what looks like the end of the world. Laurie cites Margaret Sussman's 1946 words on Job, quote, rather than fixating uselessly on the past, Job's experience signals a transformative turn. Job's suffering remains inexplicable, but he learns that it is his part that his part is not to grasp and understand, but to live out of the unfathomable. Lisa cites words by the ethicist and pragmatist Willis Jenkins, just heard. We may encounter ethical political problems of a magnitude that humans are incompetent to solve, such as climate change. Not only can we not understand the entangled causes and solutions, but we cannot marshal the moral resources it would take to imagine a different climate future and take action on it. I'll add one note, Lisa. When I'm using the term, others with me, reparative reasoning, offered a helpful corrective on the use of that term reasoning. But we're trying, with a lot of chutzpah, to change the word reasoning. That's why we're using it. There's no way to stop philosophers and other scholars from using the word reasoning. We want them to use that word to mean everything you said in the last, rather than say, no, don't use reasoning. I'm worried that when you don't use the word, it kind of loses the stature that the Enlightenment has given to reason. We want to steal that term and give it back to everything you said. Instruction number 4 is to understand that last responders must engage non-finite beings or forces whose powers exceed the power of what threatens us. Laurie cites a rabbinic reading of Psalm 62, "Save me, God, for the waters are come in even to the soul. I am sunk in deep mire. There is no standing. God, let not the water flood over me, neither let the deep swallow me up." Lisa cites Pope Francis's 215 social encyclical on care for our common home, appealing for protection of the planetary environment. He emphasized that everything is connected, that climate change hits the poor person. He invited all who believe in a creator God to join in a concluding prayer. He exhorted Catholics to prioritize climate action in their curricula and in their liturgies, especially the Eucharist, inciting the forces of encountering the non-finite God. The 5th instruction is to do the on-the-ground social, political, and technological work, without which all the high-flying sciences in the world would not suffice. Made that particularly clear, devoting attention to that imperative, going, for example, as you've heard, of Pope Francis's many efforts, not brought the political will of the Church or of other nations, particularly in the North, into action. Laurie cites Hannah Arendt. There is no reason to doubt our present ability to destroy all organic life on Earth. The question is only whether we wish to use our scientific and technological knowledge in this direction. Once again, it's a political question. It's a practical question. Instruction 6 is to nurture both individual and after the end is what I really care about, and cooperative or team-based activities. Late responders must experience how to work in teams. The reason is that different individuals achieve advanced work in different fields and practices. Teams of differently skilled individuals together provide the setting and discipline for enacting the full range of these skills. Some of the most significant discoveries will arise in the space in between the individuals in those, and in between their different capabilities, because that in between is non-finite. In between is non-finite. By the way, that's what scriptural reasoning is about. It advances beyond its own circles. The character, skills, and virtues of response team. Summary. Boston College may be uniquely suited to host a conference like this one because of the way it integrates spirituality, science, and intellectual excellence with remarkable generosity. So Boston College should do everything we need to do in the future to have these. No. Are there other institutions that integrate spirituality in this way? If so, imagine a network of conferences like this one, and Laurie may know it's already happening, I don't. Sponsored by different institutions, with different combinations of individual speakers and discussants, including, for example, different disciplines of natural and social science, arts, business management, politics, and diplomacy, with on-the-ground specialists in politics and technology and activism. Each conference hosts a potential team of last responders that integrates many different specializations without which a society cannot address overwhelming threats. Perhaps such conferences are going on, I'm not sure. Either way, I conclude with a thought experiment. What skills and virtues must be displayed in any productive team of last responders? One, they're just going to be two. One, last responders must recognize the difference between what is conventional and what exceeds the limits of current conventions. To recognize the conventional, their members must have received comprehensive liberal arts backgrounds in the primary discipline, practices, histories, and on-the-ground practices of the society that faces the big threats. So the responders have to know what's already there. They have to know it very, very well. Because their responses to threat will display unconventional paradigms and powers, or else they won't work. But they must offer these in service to repairing what's already there. They have to know it very well. Responders are not cultural revolutionaries who imagine they can overturn all. Such imagining is itself an overwhelming threat that the populations of many nations are suffering from right now. Our responders must be trained by the non-finite. They and their teams are not themselves non-finite. Revolution and efforts to bring on apocalypse may prove to be idolatrous. Last responders will appropriately maintain many other resources, assumptions of their everyday society. For example, just the way quantum physicists consider quantum logic a form of the non-finite. Quantum physicists build their laser machines out of worldly materials of the everyday world following Newtonian principles. We maintain both. Finally, number two, each last responder must have some intimate relation to the non-finite. Teams of last responders should draw these different forms of relation into intense dialogue, which dialogue may contribute strongly to the team's capacity to overcome fear of threats and to transform conventional ways of thinking into processes of release. Finally, why must our responders engage God in provision? I suggest it is because the overwhelming threats we face can be addressed only through the overwhelming capacities of the non-finite. Because the prototype of our instruments of non-finite reasoning is the way that our traditions have engaged the infinitely non-finite God. We may indeed discover that medieval and modern Jewish, Christian, and Muslim sages and thinkers are in fact major sources of our worldly sciences of the non-finite, such as multivocal and thus non-finite reading and interpretation, like quantum physics. Those who practice either of these do not need to trace their work back to sources in Abrahamic Asian traditions. Nonetheless, we would readily call on them to help lead teams of late responders, but we should not overestimate the worldly power, what we may learn from our engagements with the non-finite God.
Thank you so much, Peter, for that response that further lays out some of your thinking that I know we'll be hearing throughout this conference. I wonder if Laurie and Lisa just want to dialogue about what they heard from each other and also what they heard offered from Peter. Then we'll begin to open up conversation from the floor.
I have anything sound enough to say to make it worth taking the time. And I'd like to hear from some others that are here.
Why don't we start by building in this? You're now on the team. Hearing from you first. That'd be a good way.
Okay, so the desire from the panel is to hear from the floor.
Idea. Right, we're going to enact Peter's idea.
With some reflections, questions, what stimulated you, what's provoked you. And Camille, you're around with a mic, so perhaps the floor is open. Conversation. Kevin Hughes.
Yep.
And when you're speaking, introduce yourself and your affiliation, I guess.
Hi, I'm Kevin Hughes from Villanova University. Laurie, I was really struck by your referring to the rabbis departing for Yavne and saying, let's think differently. And I'm thinking, what I would like to ask is, how much is the departure from the ruins, part of that process? And if so, how do we depart, right? How do we get space enough to think differently when it seems that the crisis that we suffer is omnidirectional and ever so imminent? So, if do we need to depart in order to think differently? And if so, then how do we do it now? Does that make sense?
That's a terrifying question. Would there be a Yavne to go to?
Yeah.
And I was someone who was like, okay, things will be bad, but they were bad in the medieval period, and the Catholics and the Jews in the corner too. They kept the manuscripts, like the notion of that wonderful book, The Swerve, about how the monks kept the manuscripts from Greek philosophy, and they spent years copying them and recopying them, and then guess what? They were there when the Renaissance woke up and stopped drinking wine, began drinking coffee. Okay, but whoa. We have manuscripts, and they were saved, because the monastic experience of we treasure the past, we save the past. So that was sort of my MO. It was like, okay, we have universities, it'll be okay, there'll be a lot of chaos, but at least we can maintain this extraordinary gift that is civilization, that is Shakespeare and the DDJ and the Talmud. We keep that, and we'll give that to our students, and there'll be a transmission, and that's our job. Okay, we can't do politics. And then two things happened. The first thing was I heard about this mirror bacteria stuff, that dark mirrors, and I thought, ooh, we may stumble backwards into total catastrophe. And having just witnessed the pandemic, where probably gain of function research, which we tried to stop, a mistake maybe, who knows? But I knowing what I know about lab accidents makes me think, no, this is catastrophic. We have to get out of our monasteries and start stopping this. But wait, we have to stop and do this. That's the first thing. Second thing was the tax on universities. In some cases, richly deserved. Speaking as a scholar of Jewish studies, who last year as a catastrophe for free thought, not as a victim. Richly deserved tax on universities, but some not richly. And the thread of the whole system of how we organize teaching itself, what is valued itself, who our students can be themselves, all of that seems a little scarier than. So I do think it's a real question. Where would be a safe place to go? Where is intellectually safe be to preserve? But I do think the task of preservation and recouping and rethinking is really important, and that's why I'm calling for it now. All Jews have to offer to this is arguments, how we think. So I'm ready to argue with you. Oh, maybe, but I don't know how far that will take us. I do think that to take the time to preserve is important. But I don't know. There's no safe place. There's not even Canada anymore.
Might be the safest place right now.
But you know what I'm saying? It's like not. There is the shuttering of the possibilities is part of the reason it's terrifying. And that, and that's why yesterday's the events yesterday were so heartening. Well, maybe there's joy and humor, maybe intellectually. But I do think that there's that's a real task for us, but it's a critical one. And Josephus' idea was survived too, and his work survives too. That's capitulation, right? And maybe that's you still have the, because he capitulated, that was a version of, so I don't know the answer to the question, but that's exactly the problem. Ubiquity.
Thank you.
We have a comment on the other side of the room from Randy. Before I get there, for the preservation of the historical record, for people viewing this video online later, the events of yesterday were the events of April 5th, 25, mass protests in the United States.
All across the country.
And across the country.
Just one more thing, just a footnote here. You notice that Peter referred to really beautiful parts of my paper that you didn't hear, but right. There is an actual longer paper, twice as long paper, and to that he was referring.
Yes, I really appreciated the panel. I have a question for Professor Cahill.
Also offer your name and institution.
I'm Randy Rashcover, and I teach at William & Mary. Really enjoyed your paper, Professor Cahill. So I had a specific question about the Amazon Synod example. And I thought it was an interesting case. That moment itself may have provided an interesting case study for both some of the recommendations that you made and perhaps some that Peter made. And the particular moment is where, so the Amazon Synod example was one where the expectation was that multiple interest groups were going to be convened in order to be able to deal with this particular issue. And then the worst case scenario sort of thing happened. There was a breakage in the communal behavior, and there was the destruction of the images or the statues or whatever it was. So I'm wondering what practical efforts were made by the Catholic Church in the wake of that particular moment of breakage, particularly in light of the Catholic Church's hope for the Amazon Synod. So more specifically, just drawing from the examples that you gave, or the kinds of recommendations. So if we're talking about political will, surely we would imagine that the Catholic Church should be an agency that, contrary to more diverse kinds of populations, probably has will, probably has political agency. Was it able to exercise that? Another angle maybe to ask the question is, you suggested that the Catholic Church needs to go beyond altruism, and it needs to advance some kind of choreography of proportionate self-interest, that mediates among groups who have self-interest undoubtedly, but to try to choreograph opportunities for proportionate self-interest. Did the Catholic Church as an institution make any attempts to stage opportunities for proportionate self-interest? So those are my questions.
A lot, very engaging, so I'll try to respond to some of it and then you can remind me what I missed out on. So the first thing is that the people throwing the images into the Tiber was not a total breakdown. I think that the synod continued. I would say on the whole it was a success. There was cyclical, further statements that came out, etc. But what it showed was resistance within the tradition from people who are competing for reading. And that was I would say that was extreme reaction. That's not most Catholics, but it just showed that it's not as easy as folks saying, now we're going to do X, right? And then the next part is, okay, what is the Catholic Church actually doing? And this is where we get into the issue of the Catholic Church existing in different contexts. So one place that the church had already been active and still was active after the encyclical and after the synod was in the Amazon region. So there's a big network of all the Catholic dioceses of the 9 countries in the Amazon region, and there was already something called the Amazonian Network, and there were not just bishops and priests and parishes, but also other Catholic organizations, all working around environmental issues. And they helped plan the synod, and then this continued even more. There's another big network, especially in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where there's mining, of course, that's going on. And so all of these efforts were increased and they're still ongoing. But the problem is that those are in the global south, right? And the Catholics in the global north take stands on the climate that pretty much trace to their demographic characteristics, as does the politics in the global south. So it's the people who are at risk that are really taking action. And then members of the church that are in solidarity, like the priests and religious and organization. So you still have this split. And the synod, and the Pope has had other synods on other topics, and what they try to do is to bring people from different cultures together so that more solidarity will be built. But this is where it then starts to break down, right? So you still don't have, everybody went to the synod, everybody saw the stuff on TV and the indigenous people in the procession, and then they tend to go back and agree on the surface, but it doesn't get implemented, just like human resolutions. So it is very much a work in progress for that reason. There's an attempt to sponsor, like the Global Catholic Climate Covenant, or the Laudato Si movement. That's international. But who in Catholic parishes in the U.S. has heard of that? Or if it hasn't been, who goes to it? Right? So it's reaching across the boundaries that still really are.
Well, and just to say, I'll go to the next question. I think you opened up a really interesting potential object of analysis, and that is, what are synods? How do synods actually operate? Are they cooperative endeavors? Are they exercises in proportionate interest? Or do they presuppose certain kinds of majoritarian interests, and they're predicated on this majoritarian interest so that they're not ultimately going to be able to open up to new understandings of proportionate interest? And also, what is the relationship, classic hammer run kind of question, what is the relationship between this kind of cognitive review that you have in a synod and actual practical activity? Are they judgment-orienting exercises? Again, let's take a diagnostic lens onto the synod and actually begin to investigate it in terms of it as an agency.
I mean, actually, just last year and the year before, the Pope had 2 other synods, which were on synodality itself. And there is a ton of Catholic literature.
Oh, wow. That's
What are
great.
synods, how do they work?
Very interesting. Very interesting.
I think Paul Murray might be going to, yes, address it. So yeah, that's a good question, and it's out there. I don't know how much it's going to solve.
Thank you. Matthew Tapey, St. Leo University. Thank you for your wonderful presentations. I thought I would make a comment and then ask a question. First, the comment is the tossing of the Amazonian images into the Tiber is an interesting example of what might be the opposite of reparative reasoning, especially in the sense that the higher theological principle of the church, or protecting some image of the church, justified for those people the violation of the natural law of stealing and the violation of the Decalogue. So I think it's just an interesting idea there of just the act of stealing those things and throwing them into the Tiber. My comment is on Peter's notion of, you said, Peter, work in teams, engage the traditions, teaching on of the non-finite God. And I wondered if one non-finite resource in each of our Abrahamic traditions is the prohibition on idolatry. And I wondered about Pope Francis's critique of national self-interest as a problem. And I wondered if idolatry of power is present there in some ways, an idolatry of national self-interest embodied in authoritarian politicians. So I guess my question is, is our teachings on against idolatry somehow relevant to responding to crises?
Open for anyone. Get close to the mic.
I'll just start quickly. So the people throwing the images into the Tiber was done in the name of acting against idolatry because they saw them as pagan images of a goddess. There was a debate about whether that's even what they represented, but what they were really acting in favor of was preserving the traditional identity of Catholicism, which is Eurocentric. And I think you could have a legitimate debate about syncretism and so on. You know, I would come out more in favor of the people who brought the images, but there's a legitimate debate, right? And then idolatry is also used analogously around various kinds of social sins or, you know, money, power, wealth. That's often mammon. You know, that's often called idolatry, where that becomes the key value and not God. But it's still very difficult to kind of turn into effective and just political will because of the fact that the very debate is about what sort of valuation constitutes idolatry. So idolatry is kind of like name calling. You're committing adultery. You have the Pachamama thing. No, you are, because you're affecting the capital. So it still needs, I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't work. And it names the unjust priority of something. That really.
Let me just, that's an argument. About the global valorization as a Trump, which I'm troubled by, actually. And I was just at a Silmar reunion years after Silmar, and the same people trying to figure out what to do about mirror biology, what to do about modernity, and then there's a call. You have to listen to the conference became about. We lost the opportunity to do anything about mirror biology. I'm not done yet, but you know, maybe. And what I think is the problem is that when I teach young scientists about ethics, what I say to them is, don't let's start with your technology. Let's start with your values for the future. What do you imagine the future will look like? What do you want the future to look like? And then it's a choice of what things you value and what things you sacrifice. And let's begin with that discussion. And what that discussion here, you start with the vision of the future. You start what do you value in the future? What does your future look like, and how do we enact that future? How does your technology serve the future? And what sacrifices will you have to make? Because you can't get everything. Don't pretend you can. And one of the troubling parts about how we discuss climate change, especially when we begin with the indigenous claim claims indigeneity, which can devolve into kind of a blood and soil Heidegger prancing around in his outfits claim that in fact that somehow the indigenous past is where we should be turned towards, or the wisdom of the past, right? No, that was slash and burn agriculture and slavery and the oppression of women, and it's just not exactly right. And I like modern ICUs. I was famously I was a neonatal intensive care nurse. I like infant ventilators. I like heart transplants. I like all that stuff. And all that stuff is incredibly carbon intensive. And I want to figure out a way to make that happen. Not to go back to, indigenous wisdom. It's not enough. That's why you have to that's why it's harder than valorization of that. And I don't know if the people at the time, who knows what they're throwing. Who knows? But some of the anti-pagan reaction is terrible and sad and racist. And some of the anti-pagan reaction is somebody like me saying, paganism, no, not paganism, not natural law, not animism, not that. We have to figure out some new way to think that's respectful of this good world, beautiful world that we love, and understand that we have to, we live now in this time, not in that time, going back. I think that we always have to hold those things in tension.
I think what I'm hearing hearing something that's sort of lurking in these three discussions that in some ways is being pushed off and pushed away, which is the apocalyptic. The dimension was really striking, especially Laurie, in terms of what you're talking about. And I'm wondering about that and whether there's ever any positive in the apocalyptic. And then also thinking in terms of traditions of Jewish messianism, which plays into this, where there's a lot of debate about whether the apocalypse is part of that or not, whether it's to be anticipated. But also very strong traditions of being passive and waiting for God to intervene. So all these things are sort of playing together in a sort of inchoate way in my mind in listening to both Laurie and Lisa making recommendations that are very activist and very much a matter of how do we avoid the apocalypse that's coming.
You know, I think I might be the only Orthodox Jew who's actually read the entire Left Behind. But I did. I also read Project 2025. Don't ask. But I did read that whole series. And what's interesting about that series, Evangelical Protestant series, is how activist it is. The people who passively waited are the ones who were taken to rapture. Apparently nice for them. And the people that stay behind are the Offlaw guys. They form a coalition. And when Peter was saying about the teams, it's really right out of the Left Behind series. This notion of these plucky teams of multi-racial, multi-ethnic, multi-gendered teams. You've never read it. Believe me, they're there. And they go around and they fight the bad guy, especially the Pope, actually. They and the UN. But they're out there fighting forces of evil, going through seals and all that, going through that as activists, surviving as activists and battling their way to Jerusalem, hoping to rebuild the third temple. It's very activist, very activist. And I am so puzzled by this because is this what Christianity has in mind for the? I don't know that, and I mean, through it. But I do think that that's metaphorically alive for lots of our fellow citizens. By the way, why I read it. Best-selling series, etc. So clearly that's metaphorical. So that's one. I think the trouble with passivity is the level of horror, the level of the colleague who was the most gung-ho scientist said to me, and this is worse than nuclear war, because in nuclear war there'd be survivors. But if neurobiology, there won't be anything. There won't be any food. There won't be any bunny rabbits. There will be nothing. You can be in your bleached room with floor, I guess, bleaching everything, but there won't be anything to eat. So it's too late for passivity. Because we've intervened already in the world in such a way that it makes the catastrophe different from or being a peasant. I mean, I think that's somehow it has something to own culpability, own.
About the apocalyptic.
Who's that? Biblical scholar, also could be. So I would just say, first of all, I've been studying apocalyptic literature over the past year or so in relation to And something that I found out or realized was that the apocalyptic literature is always written in a social context. The context is powerlessness, where the community is relying on the divine to do combat with the enemy. And that literature is not really written or read or heard in the circumstances that are being described. So some scholars are arguing that literature does reflect and give hope in the face of powerlessness, but it's also a way of shoring up and clarifying the identity of the community and relativizing the evil political powers that's not ultimate. So it can, there's a sort of a sub-branch of commentary on apocalypticism that says within it there's an enablement of everyday resistance. So you can't defeat the whole system, but the Jews, for example, were able to get certain accommodations under the Roman Empire or under other rulers through not armed resistance, but through political negotiations. So it's a literature for bad times. But it's not totally hopeless or passive in the way it was used and the way it formed. So I would prefer not to see it as totally passive, but as creating, for what I was talking about, effective knowledge and political will, it is creating a universe that can nourish identity, reliance, hope, confidence, that what we're looking at is not what we do worship, and that God is still supreme over everything that's going on. And just from a Catholic ethics standpoint, I would say we still have a responsibility for justice. Yeah.
Hello. First of all, thank you so much for such insightful papers. My question is to Professor Ochs, but I'd be happy if Professor Lisa or Professor Laurie would like to respond as well. And my question is regarding the practical aspect of responding to crises, and especially as we're beginning to think about the kind of responders there are. And I wanted to ask regarding the sphere of influence that you imagine those responders to have. I ask this because even having worked for a year in the private sector, it seems like the resources that we draw upon as scholars are very different than people who are actually going to these summits, the UN summits that we talked about, people who are actually heralding the AI change. They're not often thinking as much about theology or thinking about ways of relating to the non-finite. So are we thinking of these responders only in the context of the scholarly community? And then could we take Professor Jenkins' approach where maybe starting with what is immediate in front of the person, so being ethical towards one's own family, then the sphere of influence could grow to the community and maybe disseminating knowledge that the scholars come up with? Or can we talk to these responders in non-scholarly context? Should we? And if yes, then how so?
Something brief. I use the term last responder because I'm thinking of first responders. I'm thinking of the need to go into the fire and address the problem now. I'm using that term, a little wryly, hoping that one of the consequences of, or the implications of the papers we heard was that, I don't know about the word scholar, but thinkers and scientists, as well as practitioners on the ground, all of those, we've mentioned all the whole array, that they collectively need to become last responders or first responders at a different level. So I agree if you're saying it isn't just scholars. But I want to say a last sentence by connecting what you said to the question that Kevin Hughes brought to Laurie before, Laurie, where can we turn? I mean, all of the speakers, as I look, are employed by universities and colleges. They certainly have the time, almost a monastic-like time, in those places to do a lot of work. And they don't have to do that work only as scholars. They go outside, they apply their work, as you do in industry. The thing is, do the guilds force us in the university to only do what's conventional? Because conventional doesn't mean superficial. Really brilliant, the smartest stuff about what we already know. And we support that. But what we're facing will not be aided by such scholarship. The question is, what proportion of the already protected university scholars, independently of what this may do, but they'll still be survivors. Enough. What are they doing? What are they studying? Why do they separate themselves from thinking as they do, but in relationship to first responders? So if that's the implication of what you're saying.
One of Peter's usual mentions here is his creative way of using responders, because for me it captures this notion of too late for first. Go in and stop the fires and rescue people. No, we're walking among ruins in a very important way. The planet's already, that's not over. The California of my childhood that I grew up in, that is already gone. It's burned up. You know, quite literally, my parents' house, my sister's house, my nephew's house, all burned up 2 months ago. But also the redwoods burned up before. The repeated fires in California have taken much of California away, and it's like the kind of gone, right? And much of our planet is damaged, perhaps beyond terribly gone. The world is really different than the 1950s. And so the last responders we have to come, because there might be embers. There might be things we have to still, there's other things we have. And I think that's really an important notion of knowing where we are, knowing the time is important. We don't have endless amounts of time. 5 years ago, maybe people, about 10 years. We did. About 10 years, and then kept rolling out, and they kept failing over. That's important to know. One sad little example is it's not only universities, it's also our institutions. It's my beloved AAR, right? AAR, I submitted two different sections, a panel on a team with the two leading scientists in neurobiology, and me and some other scholars. Both papers have been rejected. No, we're not going to do that now. We're not going to think about it now. And I'm like, and here I am frantically saying, we have to have like as big as the anti-nuclear movement has to be this anti-neurobiology movement. We have to do something. We at least talk about it at the AAR. The answer is no. So yeah, I don't think people have the sense of urgency that needed. And that's a real problem. A real problem to figure out. I don't know how to fix that. But hopefully, I came to Boston College. Tell you about it so you could work on it. But I do think that sort of thing has to happen over and over, and crisis after crisis. Something about the urgency. There was a great sign at yesterday's presentation that said, "Things are so bad, even the introverts." Really lovely.
Lisa, do you want to have a final word?
Well, I just we have 1 minute. I just want to make one comment, which is, I don't think that either the so-called global north or south should be redefined as the solution to everything. I think what certainly Catholic social teaching, the value or what's being advised is to turn to those who've been most excluded, because people who have power are much more likely and able to use it in their own interest. So it's by turning geographical. Obviously, in the regions of the privileged parts of the world, there is a diversity of communities whose subsidies impact very diversely. So it's more turning to sources of wisdom that are not always communities. So, and I do not trust, I think it's good to do this, but not trust as the sole solution, turning to the universities or the monasteries or the intellectuals or the humanistic disciplines. You'll see that the indigenous communities are something in the past. They're living in the same world, but they're living in a different relation to the natural environment, which has evolved. And so what is it that is not yet heard from those environments? That's what the Amazon Synod is trying to bring.
Here's the problem, Chris, which is the excluded of art of the world. First of all, you have to do. Yeah, you can't. I'm in the university. Yeah. My obligation has to be, in my opinion, I have to do. Otherwise, it's very easy for me to participate and be. I have my sacrifice, my involvement, my sacrifice. Right? What I will have to do. The oppressed of the world, the you said it, the Catholics who by and large prison of color Catholics. What is the problem? Right? So we heard the voice of the oppressed and the marginalized, and we voted for this reality.
Yeah, but so why?
Well, I know people voted. It may not be less than we. No, I understand. Yeah, I understand that. But I think we have to be, when we call for public discourse, we have to understand that it may not be people who agree with us. It may be people who really disagree and do trust us and don't trust us to put this together at all. And that have a different idea of what Catholicism is, a different idea of Judaism is, and really fiercely passionate in all emotionality and all this stuff. You say you want to really lose this idea we have about what is real and what is true. And so that really makes it a little more ironic and frightening. Because I ended every paper I've ever written talking about the dialogue. And now I think it's so critical. And so did I really only need a public that agrees with me and my liberal values? But do I really, really want to have people that really disagree with me and don't share their values and also have some other reason, some other way? That's why I think it's starting first with what the speakers want, as opposed to something else. So I'm just putting it out there as a new thought, a new way, another call for a new way.
Well, I think we see here at the end that there's a lot more to unpack, but I think this panel's really been great for opening up the kinds of conversations we're hoping to have during this conference. So let's thank them. It's really well done.